Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Mike. If I haven't met you, would love to connect after the chat. But today I'll be talking about increasing the max effective balance. I should have put the EIP number up there. It's EIP 7251. And yeah, I should say this work is done with a very strong collaboration with Lion at DAppNode, or he's a Nimbus, and then also Terrence and the other members of the Ethereum Foundation. So yeah, just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll do kind of two halves of the talk. The first will be outlining some of the mechanisms and parts of the consensus spec that have to do with the effective balance and kind of motivate the problem that we're trying to solve with this EIP. And the proposal is really quite simple, so that'll just be one quick slide, and then we'll go through a number of reasons why we think this is important both for the security and the health of the network and the long-term staking benefits for the solo validators. So yeah. Great. So I thought it would be helpful, just because this topic is has a lot of very specific domain knowledge, to just run through some of the spec values and just talk about what they actually mean. So in the consensus spec, there's a few different constants that are really important for this staking, the kind of core staking protocol. One of them is the max effective balance here, which is set to 32 ETH. And the interesting thing about this value is it sets an upper bound on the effective balance of a single validator, but it also is the minimum balance to become a validator. So you can kind of think of it as both the minimum and the maximum value that a single validator can have in the protocol. And this is kind of the view from the consensus layer of how much a single validator can control of the total stake. The second kind of important component here is what's called the validator effective balance. So this is one of the very core features of the validator, class. And it essentially just says how much stake the validator has according to the consensus layer. So this is incremented in whole values of ETH. So according to the consensus layer, it can only have either 32 ETH, 31, 30, all the way down to 16 ETH. So it can go below 32 ETH. This would happen if there's either slashing or inactivity leak from the validator not fulfilling their duties that they promised. But it'll never go above 32 ETH as currently implemented. And the way that is enforced in the protocol is through the thing called the partial withdrawals sweep. So yeah, sorry I'm showing code on screen. I know it's like a faux pas, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of just run through it real quick. So basically, during every block, as the block is being constructed, a set of withdrawals are created and inserted into the block. And the withdrawals were activated after Capella, so this was in April. And some of the withdrawals are what are called partial withdrawals. So the partial withdrawals just check if a validator has more than 32 ETH. It scrapes off any ETH up to that 32 and sends it out to a validator withdrawal credential. So yeah, it does this process automatically, and it goes through all the validators and slowly kind of removes their excess balance and puts it back towards, or to exactly that 32 ETH. And it uses the withdrawal credential, which is actually an execution layer address. So this can either be an EOA or a contract, and this is how essentially solo stakers can realize the rewards for their staking, and also how protocols can pool the rewards across many validators if they send it to a contract. So yeah, the sweep takes about 6 days to complete. And so essentially how it works, if you run your own validator now, is every 6 days you'll get about 0.015 ETH sent to your withdrawal credential, and that'll kind of be that. That just happens regularly. You don't have to pay gas for that withdrawal. It's handled through the consensus layer, and yeah, that's kind of the process. So another important thing to mention is EIP 7002, and this EIP is from Danny, and it adds execution layer triggerable exits. So it's kind of a mouthful, but essentially what it allows is validators to trigger their exits from their withdrawal credential. So the withdrawal credential, again, is just an account in Ethereum. And so if there's kind of, you can kind of think of there being two keys. There's the BLS keys that are used to do the consensus layer stuff, to sign attestations, to sign blocks. And then there's the key that controls the account that is associated with the withdrawal credential. So the validator could, instead of exiting through the consensus layer by sending a signed voluntary exit through the consensus mechanism, they can actually just trigger an execution layer exit by calling a precompile and submitting the transaction on chain. So this kind of makes the withdrawal process a little more flexible. And another really kind of awesome part about this is it allows you some redundancy in terms of withdrawing and exiting your ETH. So currently, I should say 7002 is not implemented yet. This is under review and hopefully will be included in an upcoming hard fork. But as of today, if you lose your validating keys, you're kind of out of luck. You can keep, you'll keep losing your ETH because you're not fulfilling your staking duties, and eventually you'll decay down to 16 ETH and your validators will get ejected. But that's a pretty bad case scenario because now you just lost half of your ETH just because, and it'll take like 20 years or whatever. Like it's gonna be a really long time until your ETH gets out. But if you have execution layer triggerable exits, then in that case, all you have to have is control of the withdrawal credential. And even if you lose your validating keys, you can just trigger the exit and get out of there. Additionally, you can have kind of extra programmability around the exits. So again, these withdrawal credentials could be an EOA, and so you can decide when that contract emits or makes a call to the precompile to actually initiate the exit. There's a lot more like flexibility and customizability around initiating the exit. And the reason I bring this up, it might seem kind of disjoint, but part of the max effective balance change is also allowing execution layer partial withdrawals. And I'll talk more about why that's important kind of from the UX perspective. But execution layer partial withdrawals are really just a simple extension of the execution layer exits. So instead of withdrawing all of your ETH, you could withdraw, say, 10 of the ETH without exiting your validators altogether. So that'll be coming up more. Cool. Another common question we have to answer is why 32 ETH was there as the cap in the first place. So there was kind of originally some different proposals. Some 1,500 ETH was floated at one point, but obviously that makes it very far out of reach for solo stakers. And the historical context is actually basically around the original sharding roadmap design. So in the original sharding design, there was these committees. And the attesting committee, which is the full set of validators that are supposed to attest during a given slot. So everyone is in one attesting committee per epoch. So we split the validating set into 32 different groups. And the attesting committee is further divided into what's called a committee. I call them subcommittees because I think it's more clear. But in the spec, it's just called committee. And each of these committees had to be controlled by an honest majority in the original sharding design in order for the protocol to remain safe. And yeah, this kind of means that if you have larger effective balances, the committees are quite small. You know, the target committee size is only 128. So if you had a single validator that controls it, let's say 2048 ETH, then they would control a majority of that subcommittee kind of out of the gate. And then if they decided to do anything malicious, then they're kind of immediately able to do that, and there's no defense against it because they have such a large stake in the protocol. So the kind of good news here is that with the new dank sharding approach and proto-dank sharding more generally, is we don't actually need these committees to be majority honest anymore. We use these committees for something called attestation aggregation, which is kind of a smaller piece in the puzzle of the consensus layer. And in the security assumption of those aggregate attestations, we actually only need one honest aggregator rather than a majority honest of the whole committee. So that makes it a lot easier, and it allows us to say, okay, the security of these subcommittees we can analyze in a much more, the security guarantees of having larger validators in the subcommittees are much stronger, which is the great news, and it kind of makes this whole design possible. Otherwise, it would be kind of a non-starter. Cool. So that was all preliminaries. There's kind of a lot there, but hopefully once we walk through the implications of the proposal, it'll be clear why all this machinery is needed and the context for what we're trying to do. So yeah, the proposal is pretty simple. It just says take the max effective balance from 32 ETH to 2048 ETH. And yeah, the really key thing here is that we're not changing the minimum balance to become a validator at all. That remains 32 ETH. There was a lot of confusion around that when we originally published the proposal, but the idea is, I said at the beginning that 32 was both the minimum and the maximum amount of, cool. Yeah, so still 32 ETH to become a validator, but now validators have more flexibility in the amount of ETH that they can control all the way up to 2048 ETH. And additionally, the second kind of core component of this is to allow the arbitrary execution layer partial withdrawals. And I say arbitrary because the idea is they should be able to withdraw as much stake as they want so long as their validator remains above the 32 ETH minimum. So let's say you have a validator with 1,000 ETH in it and you want to withdraw 100 to pay taxes or whatever, then you can withdraw 100 because you're still well above the 32 ETH threshold. And that's kind of the simple extension of 7002 that would be necessary for this proposal. Cool, so now we can talk about why this actually matters and what problem we're trying to solve. So this figure shows the validator set size growth into the future if the queue, the activation queue, remains full for the next, I guess it's for the next year. And the interesting thing about this is it's actually exponentially increasing. And the reason for that is because every epoch, we allow a certain number of new validators to activate based on what's called a churn limit. And that churn limit is a function of the total stake in the system. Yeah, the churn limit is a function of the total stake in the system. So as the total stake goes up, the churn limit also goes up respectively. And so more validators can get activated during each epoch. And so right now, each of these vertical red dotted lines shows basically a new increment in the number of validators that can activate per epoch. Right now we're at 10, and that's here. So this would be 11 per epoch, 12 per epoch, 13. And of course, the lines get closer together because the exponential growth of the validator set would allow the exponential increase in the amount of churn as well. So this is kind of the doomsday scenario because we go from around 700,000 validators right now to potentially 2.2 million in 1 year, and there's reason to believe that this would have serious implications for the stability of the network and the sustainability of the network. Right, so yeah, again, this is kind of the worst case scenario because it depends on the activation queue remaining full, but I think it's quite clear, and hopefully the next slides will show that as of right now, we're clearly not in an equilibrium where the number of validators is stabilizing in any way. And actually, this data shows, and this is from validatorq.com. I really recommend the website. It's great. It shows that the number of validators is basically just up and to the right. And especially post-withdrawals, we see that the queue just remains full and is just continuing to pile up and grow. So the figure on the right shows the amount of supply staked. And yeah, this is also growing extremely rapidly. Like it grows with the number of validators, but now we're up to around 17 or 18%. Again, we don't know where this will stop, but it's pretty clear that it's not slowing down right now. And the reason for this is basically it's a really good deal to be a validator. This shows the issuance curve of the consensus layer rewards for active validators. And the dotted red line here, this first red line, shows where we are now. And the purple line shows the APY that would be corresponding to 1 million validators in the active validator set. So we see that it only goes down from about 3.5% to 3%. So we don't have any expectation that we would suddenly reach a point where at 1 million validators, people stop joining the activation queue. We don't have any evidence of that. And yeah, this figure shows the actual APR, for some estimate of the APR. And the reason it's higher than what it looks like it should be on the left is because there's both consensus layer rewards and execution layer rewards. So the kind of issuance curve that people talk about mostly is from the consensus layer. That's your rewards for proposing blocks, for attesting, for being on time. But the execution layer rewards come when you're actually selected as the proposer and you get to build a block that, that extracts MEV. So basically, it seems too profitable to be a validator. And if you participate in MEV Boost, which about 95% of blocks today use MEV Boost, so basically the total plurality, this allows you to earn MEV rewards through on the execution layer that are almost as good as the consensus layer rewards. So there's extra carrot to becoming a validator, especially in the MEV world that we live in. Yeah, so why is a large validator set even a problem? This is kind of an obvious question to ask. And I think there's a couple reasons. One of them I want to talk about is network stability. So this figure from Tony shows the missed slots since the merge and which slot in the epoch was actually missed. So essentially what happens is the first two slots of the epoch have a way higher rate of missed slots, and that's because the epoch processing, which takes place when you transition from one epoch to the next, depends on the size of the validator set. So you have to do a linear scan through the validator set. You do your kind of last set of updates and withdrawals. And because that process is quite heavy and it introduces like latency into when you actually produce the block, oftentimes those blocks are late, they get reorged out of the network, or the slot gets missed altogether. And yeah, this will only continue to get worse as the number of validators increases. Additionally, just overall, the number of reorgs has been going up quite significantly since, I guess this plot shows, since like last December. And it's not going up too quickly, but it is significant. And especially after, around the April-May timeline, which is when withdrawals were activated, the activation queue has remained full since then. These reorgs continue to increase, and reorgs are generally bad for the network because that whole slot is missed, and those transactions have to wait for another block to get included, so you have longer inclusion times. You also can have kind of attacks where transactions that were supposed to be private became public and then were used in a different block where they weren't expected to be included. So there's kind of all sorts of issues around reorgs, and that's one thing we really want to avoid. And yeah, especially this epoch processing is quite concerning. And there's also this idea that, as we grow the validator set, the client teams can start to do optimizations to handle a larger validator set load, but this kind of introduces extra complexity into the clients, and it also just makes them so that they can't ossify in the same way that they would before, and there's higher risk of client bugs. There's just higher fragility properties of the network in terms of if something does go wrong, it could go very wrong. And actually, the next example, and this figure is from Tomas, was basically what happened during the May 11th and 12th non-finality event. And part of what happened here is these attestations for a few different client pairs started going completely offline. And the client team scrambled to figure out what was going on. Eventually, they determined that it was basically old attestations trying to be processed. And they also correlated it with the fact that the activation queue was constantly full. The beacon nodes were already under heavy strain in terms of getting all the validators activated and keeping the queue maintained in memory. So yeah, basically this is partially this whole non-finality event, which was kind of the biggest instance of the Ethereum network experiencing like not a full outage because we were continuing to produce blocks, but kind of a partial outage. And this was something that we're taking very seriously. Right, and additionally, beyond just the kind of the heavy computational load of a large validator set, there's also issues around the size of the beacon state. So that just means more RAM There's longer signature aggregations, so this might have higher CPU requirements and more P2P networking overhead. So all of these things are also kind of centralizing vectors in the fact that becoming a solo staker just requires more and more hardware, requires more sophistication, more network bandwidth, and that's something we also obviously want to avoid. Yeah, also another really important reason we would want to increase the max effective balance is for single slot finality. So this headline is from a post Vitalik made in, I think, October of 2022, and he calls it Path Towards Single Slot Finality. And the TLDR is that the current consensus mechanism has some issues. It has issues around UX, meaning you don't actually get finality very quickly. It's like a 6-minute thing. That was a trade-off made based on kind of a heuristic. It's not ideal, and the transaction gets included probably in about 12 seconds, but then you have kind of soft finality after 3 blocks, and then real finality after maybe 6 to 7 minutes. So that's kind of not great. Safety issues, this is mainly to do with the reorgs that I was pointing out earlier. And also, we haven't seen any large-scale attacks on the network, but anyone who could have a large amount of the staking power could basically arbitrarily reorg in order to steal high MEV opportunities. And it's possible that in the event of a black swan, huge million ETH MEV opportunity, someone would try to reorg the chain. Like, that's just the reality. And also protocol complexity. So a huge amount of the consensus layer spec is revolving around handling these epoch processings and how they relate to the block production. There's kind of like 2 separate things that have a lot of interaction. And in some ways, it's kind of a brittle way to solve the problem. And it only gets more complex as we start iterating on the roadmap, as I'll talk about in the next slide. So yeah, the kind of question mark is, how do we actually get to SSF? Because SSF solves all our problems. Single slot finality means we get the transaction finalized ASAP, and no reorgs are possible. So there's a few ways we can do this. We could do a rotating validator set, which means only a subset of the validators are active at a single time. We could think about validator set capping, but this has all sorts of issues because if you cap it as it currently is, then basically no one has an incentive to leave ever. It's kind of enshrining a moat around the current stakers. If you say, okay, we cycle the oldest stakers out, then it becomes an auction to compete for the spot, the next open spot. So there's all sorts of kind of potential issues there. You could change the validator economics directly. This has kind of weird implications, especially if you think about going to negative issuance. So the consensus layer curve could go negative. The rewards for being a validator would still probably be positive because of the MEV. But basically what you're telling stakers is that they put 32 ETH in, and if there's not enough MEV, their stake will go down, which is a pretty tough sell and kind of a strong opinionated stance in terms of validator economics. So these are kind of like extreme changes, right? That really touch the core elements of the protocol and are kind of monetary decisions that have a lot of both political and kind of lots of considerations before we could make any of those. But I guess the argument for the max effective balance change is that it's more of a tech debt solve, and it gives us time to decide how we want to fully address the validator set size without needing to do something more drastic kind of immediately. Additionally, beyond SSF, there's ePBS and MEV burn. So these are 2 other things that we're thinking about that kind of really benefit from a smaller validator set or a simpler consensus mechanism. So this figure shows the current ePBS design. I won't go too much into it, but the TLDR here is that ePBS changes the consensus rules. So we already I talked about how the consensus layer is already quite complicated. ePBS just adds to that complexity and adds to kind of the fragility of these timing slots within the slot. And that's something we would be worried about given the complexity of the network already. And ePBS also directly enables MEV burn, which is actually a much more palatable way to address validator economics. So changing the consensus layer reward curve is kind of like a little taboo because that's kind of the monetary policy of Ethereum. But MEV burn is kind of taking away these MEV rewards from validators and making it less valuable for the validator themselves in terms of MEV. But hopefully it'll make the equilibrium staking APY a little, make it so that we're closer to that and it becomes slightly less desirable to be a validator, which is kind of a weird position to be in. Also, we hope to make solo staking better. So yeah, this shows, I guess, the 5 biggest stakers by network participation. Lido obviously is the subject of a lot of debate. It has almost 1/3 of the total stake. Coinbase has 10%. And a big reason why the pools are so attractive is because they have a few features that are really desirable. First, auto compounding means that if I put in 10 ETH and it accrues value and becomes 11 ETH, then I earn staking rewards on the whole 11 ETH rather than having to withdraw that 1 ETH and only earning rewards on the 10. And additionally, it has these flexible staking amounts. So if I have, let's say I have more than 32 ETH but less than 64, like 40 ETH, for example, I can stake all 40 of that ETH through Lido, but if I want to run my own validator, I can only stake 32 of that ETH, and I have to deploy the 8 ETH somewhere else. So yeah, basically, the auto compounding and these advantages of the pools quickly make it better to just join a pool than to be a solo staker. And there's a few different articles that show, like, after a year or so of being a staking pool versus a solo validator, you'll be in better shape even though you're paying 10% of your rewards to Lido. And so yeah, ideally we would like to give those benefits to solo stakers without needing to join the pool, and the max effective balance does that. So because they can go beyond 32 ETH, their effective balance accrues value and accrues weight, so they'll go 32, 33, 34, and they'll keep earning additional rewards on that compounding ETH. And also there's the flexibility that I described before. Of course, the flexibility still requires you to have at least 32 ETH, which is quite a high barrier of entry. But in the future, if the validator set is in a more controlled state, that's how we can start thinking about maybe reducing the 32 to 16 or 8 in order to make it more approachable to becoming a solo staker. Cool. So yeah, key takeaways. Increasing the max EB is an easy tech debt fix, easy. And it should help slow the growth of the validator set kind of immediately out of the box. It's a better solution than directly changing the validator economics, certainly less controversial. And it also has the kind of added side benefit of just making solo staking objectively better. And additionally, it slots right into the roadmap before single slot finality, ePBS, and MEV burn, all additional tools to make the network more stable and more sustainable. Yeah, so the QR code here points to this FAQ we wrote. This should help answer any other questions that are remaining, and thank you very much.
So we'll take questions, but maybe I can start. Obviously, you're slowing the growth of, or you will slow the growth of validators by increasing the maximum effective balance. And you're not changing the issuance curve, right? That's what you mentioned. So you basically pushing or making validators or people that are running validators more interested to run other validators. Would you keep this high APY over time, or will it change with other mechanism? Can you just come back on that?
Yeah, for sure. I like to think of the fact that the max effective balance is 32 ETH as almost kind of artificially inflating the size of the validator set. Like, it makes it look like we have 600,000 validators, but really there's like Lido that controls like however many million ETH. So in some ways, we won't get any closer to the equilibrium of the total amount of staked ETH that we want, or that is sustainable. But it'll at least allow us time to kind of reduce this redundancy, reduce this artificial inflation in a way that makes it so that we can kind of bide our time until we figure out what's the right way to address the validator economics. So I think of it as not really a Band-Aid. It's just like a future compatible fix that, that reduces this inefficiency of the consensus layer and allows us to make decisions about the longer term economics with more time and more room to decide. Yeah.
You want to start? Okay. Yes, so you said the churn limit is currently a function of the total number of validators, and it leads to an exponential growth of validators number. Why could we just simply cap the churn limit to, let's say, 12 or 13 validators per epoch? And so we go from exponential growth to a linear growth. Of course, it won't solve the issue, but maybe it will add some more time to really implement like your EIP.
Yeah, totally. So this was actually brought up by Lion and Francesco in the recent all-core devs. And the idea here is, yeah, we can go from exponential growth to linear. But this is also kind of opinionated in the fact that anyone who wants to become a validator now has to wait through a longer queue. So it kind of further entrenches the existing power structure of like who's in the queue or who's in the active set already as like being like privileged more so than someone who wants to become a new validator currently. So yeah, it in some way is like a very easy, quick fix. And it was actually proposed to be included in Deneb, which is like, coming up. I don't think it will be, given the fact that all of these things kind of touch at the core level of the protocol and are really subject to a lot of debate and differing opinions. But yeah, that would be a solution. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's something that comes up again in future hard forks as a potential to kind of stop the bleeding. Yeah.
Why not deleting the maximum EB entirely?
Right. Yeah. So we still do need some maximum because we don't want an entire committee to be controlled by a single validator. And also, there's issues around slashing risk here. So because the slashing penalty has to be proportional to the effective balance of the validator, if you had one validator with like, let's say 20,000 ETH or something, a single slashing event could have significant impact to the total amount of ETH in the system. So yeah, that's the incentive to not go too high. Even if we went up to like, let's say 10,000 or 20,000, I think most staking operators wouldn't do that just because the slashing risk is, even if they've never been slashed before, it's still like way too risky to think about losing 200 ETH because of one bad signature. So yeah, we even aren't sure that people will fully consolidate all the way to 2048. So 2048 is 64 times higher. So your slashing risk goes from 1 ETH now to 64 ETH in that case. So we're not even sure that people will take full advantage of the consolidation. Maybe they would start by consolidating into 128 ETH chunks rather than 32 ETH chunks. But yeah, generally speaking, if staking pools want to consolidate, that could also reduce their infrastructure costs because now they have to run fewer validators. Fewer validators could mean fewer beacon nodes. Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah, so if we look at the liquid staking space, like having 32 ETH per validator and no compounding, that's like a strong assumption for like the way Lido is designed, for example. How do you think like this EIP will change protocols like Lido in terms of architecture? And did you have like any concern from their team or any other liquid staking protocol?
Yeah, so one of the kind of interesting ways about the communication of the first proposal was that I was trying to pitch it as very beneficial for the large staking pools. But actually the feedback I got from Lido and some others is that they don't actually see it as that beneficial, which might actually be a good thing because we don't really want to incentivize them given they already have such a large amount. But yeah, the actual like compounding stuff that they do now is they have the withdrawal sweep. It consolidates, since they have so many validators, they can spin up maybe 20 or 30 new validators each day just from the withdrawal sweep. So their architecture wouldn't necessarily need to change. I haven't talked too deeply about like what their actual smart contract stuff would depend on. I was talking to Izzy last night, and he said Rocket Pool might have 32 ETH hard-coded somewhere in their infrastructure, and those might be non-upgradable. So again, these are the type of things that make a proposal that seems kind of like an obvious no-brainer be a lot more political, because there's already it's kind of like a core assumption of the protocol, this 32 ETH thing, and changing it has kind of a lot of downstream effects that are hard to predict, but we still think it's worth it. At least I do.
Hi. Hello. Oh, okay. You mentioned that the benefit of auto compounding, right? Like for validators, that the protocol would recognize their stake as increased as they get the rewards from the consensus layer. But won't they need at least 1 ETH for the protocol to recognize? So why wasn't there no adjustment to the minimum balance increment?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, the context here is that since the effective balance is only measured in full ETH increments, you don't actually get the auto compounding benefit until your 32 accrues a whole new ETH, and then you're at 33, and then 34, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, this is definitely something we're thinking about. And you could think about something where you make the increment instead of I guess using the 1 ETH increment benefits the big guys more, because if you have 1,000 ETH, you get to 1,001 way faster than someone who has 32 ETH and they're trying to get to 33. So you could have it be like, oh, you have to increase 10%, and so everyone increases, moves up the schedule at an even rate. But yeah, we didn't include it in the initial proposal just because it adds complexity. So the reason the 1 ETH increment is used now is mostly an engineering decision, I think, from the beacon nodes, where they just want to be able to cache the values of the actual balances. And having integer values is a lot easier than trying to represent all the substates. But yeah, that's something that I think would probably be part of the future, or this a quick follow EIP if we really want to go ahead with the auto compounding, for sure.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So my question is, if you increase the balance, is this then more, if my balance is higher, am I more likely to be selected as a proposer? And how is this then good for solar stakers who are less likely to have more ETH?
Right. So yeah, this is a great question. It's been asked multiple times. So yeah, the probability that you're selected as a proposer is still proportional to your weight versus the total weight of all of the stake. So you can kind of think of it as a validator with 32 ETH still gets selected the same number of times. If they belong to a 3,200 ETH pool, they still get selected once every 100 slots. But if they have a higher balance, that validator just gets selected, let's say, twice as frequently. And the benefit here is that you select them proportionally to the total amount of stake, and they'll still get selected as regularly. It's just they're using the same validator rather than 2 different validators to get selected. So one validator could propose quite regularly, but they would have been proposing regularly before. It would have just been different validators rather than the same validator, if that makes sense. But yeah, so the rewards should be the same for everyone still, no matter what your effective balance is.
Just a quick question. Does this perhaps reduce the fault tolerance of the system in any way if you have fewer validators in the validator set?
Yeah, so there is a whole set of security considerations that we walked through, which is basically what's the probability that someone controls a whole attesting committee, given they could have a 2048 ETH validator that has a ton of weight. The TLDR, I guess, I'll refer you to the doc, but the TLDR is that we don't think this significantly changes the security properties at all. As I mentioned before, the slashing penalties could go up. So people could get, there could be like larger slashing exposure for validators. And slashings are also correlated. So if you get slashed, if a big validator gets slashed at the same time as another big validator, that's much worse than two small validators getting slashed together. But generally speaking, we aren't too worried, especially because 32 is kind of an arbitrary number in the first place. And so bumping it up 64x, we don't think is significant enough to cause any issues. But this is another one of the reasons why we don't want an unlimited cap. We don't want 1 million ETH validators.
Yeah. But does the probability increase linearly or exponentially between the two models?
The probability of?
The probability, or we're afraid of a large staker being a bigger part of the committee. So the chances of a single 64, let's say, ETH to be there and have 64 weight compared to having two ones. As the weight grows, does the chance of it having a larger stake, let's say you have 5 of them, you have 5 large, so in order to get to control the committee, let's say.
Yep.
Are the chances of that happening, they're growing, obviously. Do
They are.
grow linearly or do they grow exponentially?
So they actually do grow exponentially, but because of the committees being so big already, like basically the law of large numbers just kind of has our back. The security considerations doc shows basically the probabilities before and after, and even with like a 20x consolidation of the validator set, like you can kind of think of the worst case scenario as all the attackers consolidate and all the honest people don't consolidate, because now all the attackers have like these huge validators that could control, and the little guys have like much lower probability of being on the same committee. And even in that kind of worst case scenario, the probabilities are still like basically completely fine because of the law of large numbers.
Okay, amazing. Please.
Thank you.
Mike.